The story of Cuba before the Castros. To understand Cuban politics, we must understand that Cuba technically had independence twice. Many would even say that Cuba had three independence. One, Cuba fought for their independence from Spain, and they got their independence there about 1898. However, they were actually occupied by America, so you wouldn't call that independence technically until 1902. However, in 1959, Castro claimed that the revolution is where the independence started. So see, technically that would have been three places in independence. Cuba's first major war for their independence took place between 1868 and 1878, and this laid the groundwork for future rebellion in Cuba. The first failed war for independence in Cuba started on October 10, 1868. This is when the sugar mill and slave owner Carlos Manuel issued a decree, and it released all of his slaves, freeing them to fight for Cuba for independence. However, Carlos Manuel and his slaves got pushed back by other white farmers and landowners. In 1878, the rebel leaders signed the Pact of Zanjan, although it failed to give Cuban independence, but it compelled Spain to gradually abolish slavery in Cuba in 1886. By this, Cuban national hero José Martí was in exile hiding in New York in 1892, where he formed the Cuban Revolutionary Party. When José Martí assembled his forces and went back to Cuba to fight the Cuban Revolution for independence, he died very early in the war at the Battle of Dos Rios on May 19, 1895. The United States intervened immediately in 1898, just after the Spanish forces were collapsing in Cuba. This was later known as the Spanish-American War. After Spain was defeated, the United States established a military government on the island from 1898 until 1902. To get rid of the American, the Cuban had to sign the Platt Agreement. This enabled America to have access to Guantanamo Bay until today. 1901, Dictator Batista is born in Cuba. He's born in the Oriente province on January 16th. In Baines, only miles away from the Castro family plantation. Batista joined the Cuban army on April 14, 1921, enlisting as a private. Batista left the army and came back in 1928, where he was promoted to the rank of sergeant. There he led the revolt of sergeants, which overthrew the provisional government and instantly elevated him to the Army Chief of Staff of the rank of colonel. Batista, very smart and intellectual, led all the non-commissioned officers in a rebellion against the dictator Gerardo Machado. He conspired with the United States to force the resignation of Cuban Provisional President Ramon Grau San Martin. By 1940, Batista became president in the height of World War II. Cuba entered World War II on the side of the Allies and established relationship with the Soviet Union. Batista served from 1940 to 1944, where he stepped down. After Batista left office in 1944, between 1944 to 1952, corruption was rampant, so he had to come back and do a second coup on March 10, 1952. Batista realized he wasn't going to win the election this time, so he had to take it by force. Between 1952 and 1958, Batista allowed Havana to become the playground of the mob. Batista exposed Havana to large-scale gambling and casinos. More than 350,000 visitors came to Cuba in 1957 alone. This is because of gambling, brothels, and prostitution. Cuba became corrupted, exploited, and rising unemployment and inequality and wealth concentration among a small elite was rampant, while many Cubans were living in poverty. It is estimated that over 20,000 Cubans were vanished under Batista's regime. In response from growing opposition like the Castros, Batista suspended the Constitution and suspended freedom of speech and gathering or assembly. Batista became increasingly brutal, controlling the university and the press, and embezzled large sums of funds. By 1956, Castro came back to Cuba with 82 men after his failed coup on July 26, 1953, which was 3 years earlier. By 1957, Batista saw that he was in trouble. Thousands of students from universities started to protest. By December 11, 1958, U.S. Ambassador Earl Smith visited Batista at his lavish home in Hacienda and informed him that the United States could no longer support his regime. Batista asked if he could get exile in his lavish home in Daytona Beach, Florida. The ambassador told him no, to seek exile in Spain. On New Year's Eve 1958, Batista escaped Cuba in the early morning. He left with over 100 associates and over $700 million US. Castro came to power the very next day on January 1st, 1959. Batista lived the rest of his life in Portugal and Spain. He died on August 6, 1973 in Marbella, Spain. Now, if you find this documentary interesting, like, share, comment, and drop us your name and your city where you're watching from so we could give you a shout out in the next video.